Today, I'm going to talk about the sexual culture of ancient Rome, which lived and died in pleasure. Ancient Rome was an empire that occupied such a vast territory that it was called the Master of the Mediterranean. As it possessed such a huge territory and had such great cultural and academic influence, ancient Rome became a root throughout Europe. European culture, law, and military systems cannot be explained without ancient Rome. Among the things that ancient Rome, which had such great influence, left behind for later generations, there is one that may be somewhat uncomfortable and difficult to understand: sexual culture. Ancient Rome's attitude towards sex was so positive and open that it doesn't seem like an exaggeration to say that it lived and died in pleasure. In fact, not only ancient Rome, but also sex is a very important part of human history, just as much as the military and economy. There are many books and papers that look at history from the perspective of sex, such as the famous book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. And ancient Rome showed a highly developed civilization to the point that the word ancient seems awkward. The influence of ancient Rome is still with us today, not only in the military, but also in politics and art. As society develops, human desires and individual desires tend to flow in the direction of choice rather than necessity. Of course, sex is an essential element for human survival, and it is difficult to say that the culture of sex in ancient Rome or ancient Greece was purely about reproduction, and in fact, it was a pursuit of pleasure by choice. Simply put, as life became more comfortable, desires blossomed in people's minds, such as the desire for power and sexuality. So, shall we begin the story of ancient Rome, which was surrounded by violence and sex? First, let's find out who led the open sexual culture of ancient Rome. In general, when we think of an open and promiscuous culture, we tend to think of the rich nobles and women of relatively low status who wanted to succeed. However, in ancient Rome, the people who pursued pleasure more than anyone else and led the culture of sex were the emperors. The emperors of ancient Rome were the most powerful not only in the country, but also across the entire Mediterranean, and possessed immense power that no one dared to oppose. Based on their immense power, what the emperors enjoyed and desired was greater pleasure and stimulation. This is not only true for some emperors who were called tyrants, but also for all emperors. Caligula, who took other men's wives and drove innocent people to their deaths, and his nephew emperor, Nero, also lived in pleasure, but even saintly emperors like Augustus, who was called a saint and led the victory in the Battle of Teum, were emperors who pursued pleasure above all else. Augustus is an emperor who is evaluated as having both outstanding ability and character during his lifetime. However, Augustus took other people's wives as a given and slept with numerous virgins every night. Even Augustus's wife Livia was already married to someone else and pregnant before meeting Augustus. Augustus intercepted Livia. Augustus even ordered Livia, whom he had taken away, to examine the women who entered his bedroom every night. The irony is that it was Augustus who created the very strict Roman adultery law. If the emperor was like this, then of course ordinary citizens also freely pursued pleasure. A representative example is that there was a culture of buying and selling sex in ancient Rome, which is a very old occupation in history. In fact, it was more severe in Rome than in ancient Greece. A huge number of people were engaged in the business of buying and selling sex. The fact that there were many people means that the market was large. The types and methods were also diverse. What is more surprising than the fact that many citizens participated in buying and selling sex is that the transactions took place regardless of time and place. Of course, there were places where sex was bought and sold, such as the bustling streets of ancient Rome where the political elites gathered. But most transactions were not at all chaotic or often took place in unexpected places. Ancient Rome had a uniquely developed bathing culture, and the reason for the development of bathing culture was said to be to distinguish between Romans and foreigners. The highly developed Romans wanted to distinguish themselves from barbaric civilizations. They believed that bathing was the best way to distinguish between barbarians and civilized people. Ancient Rome's bathing culture quickly became popular and public baths spread throughout the country and became popular. Bathing culture continued to compete and developed into a place where you could exercise, enjoy massages, and even have a simple meal. It became a place where you could enjoy a wider range of services than just a place for bathing. However, there was one difference. In addition to services like massage, you could also have sexual relations if you wanted. As people began to want to satisfy their needs at bathhouses, and thus demand arose, supply naturally began to emerge. It's unimaginable now, but it was so open. Later on, 2 children were even considered one business. The phrase, going to a bathhouse, became no different from having sex. The most common transactions took place in public baths, but they were not the only places where sex took place. One of the markets that was as active as baths was the theater. Most of the plays performed in ancient Roman theaters were adult plays depicting sex. The main audience was also men. The audience could satisfy their desires alone while watching the performance, or they could choose an actress and have sex with her. There were cases where they had sex because they caught each other's eye, but most of the time it was in the form of buying and selling. As there were various places and various people involved, there were various terms used to refer to women. Women who stood naked at the entrance of a building or in a crowded place and cursed at men were called Doris, and women who imitated the howling of wolves and seduced them were called Lupa. The names also changed depending on the place. Women who traded in bars were called Blatita, and women who traded with massages and bathhouses were called Pelatrix. There were even men called Spadonas who sold sex to men with their testicles removed. What they had in common was that they were people belonging to the lower social classes. In other words, the sexual culture of ancient Rome was closely related to class. The difference between Rome and Greece is that in Greece, it was determined by ability and appearance, but in ancient Rome, the standard was class. People belonging to the lower classes could not do the business they wanted unless they were free citizens. Among them, the lowest class, slaves had to offer their bodies to their masters as soon as they wanted. Only men belonging to the class of free citizens could have a dominant relationship with the person they wanted. Free citizens not only had the ability to do whatever they wanted in a relationship, but their status was also overwhelming. No one could harm the body of a free citizen male, and if they sexually exploited a free citizen male, they were put to death. Of course, if the perpetrator was a free citizen male, they were not sentenced to death. They continued to emphasize only the status and rights of free citizens males. So what about women who were free citizens? Free citizens females were protected from forced relationships, but were severely punished if they had an affair. This system was intended to protect the property of free men. To put it simply, if a woman married a free man, she was treated as the man's property or property. In terms of women's human rights being at rock bottom, ancient Greece and ancient Rome are quite similar. Ancient Rome was also a male-centered society, just like Greece. Even so, Greece allowed both men and women to be free about their sexuality, but Rome was quite strict with women. While homosexuality between men was allowed, homosexuality between women was not tolerated. In this way, ancient Roman culture valued pleasure, but there were set taboos, of course, compared to ancient Greece. To put it nicely, it was a taboo, but to be a little more blunt, it could be seen as a contradiction and a clear loss of human rights. Rome, which had a culture of luxury, pleasure, and violence, faced a crisis as it shook greatly economically, politically, and militarily after the 2nd century. Rome, which was active and valued pleasure, disappeared. Looking at history, in times of abundance and cultural development, in a word, a time worth living in, an open culture always flourished. From this perspective, I think the times we live in are quite worth living in. This is the end of the story of ancient Rome, where people lived and died in pleasure. If you liked today's video, please subscribe to our channel, like it, and turn on notifications. Your support is a great help.